worst trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility.
The Nuremberg Trials promised justice. Some got the noose, others got years, but many, too many, got away. New names, new homes, new lives built on silence. While the ashes of their crimes still clung to the walls of forgotten camps, justice wasn't blind. It just looked the other way. The war ended, but the real reckoning was just starting. In a courtroom stitched together by justice and revenge, the world watched the masterminds of genocide sit behind glass, suited up but hollow, their eyes somewhere between panic and pride. The Nuremberg trials weren't just about verdicts. They were an attempt to pause evil, bottle it up, label it. But history doesn't follow scripts. It didn't play out clean. Some vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. Others did their time, then came back like nothing happened, resumes polished, suits crisp. A few were honored, decorated, celebrated. Some never spoke again, too guilty to forgive, too valuable to kill. This isn't a story about the trial. It's about what came after. The secret deals, the silent getaways, the PR spin, the fake names and real memoirs. It's where justice met politics and where the world's worst crimes were buried under the rush to rebuild. This isn't just history. It's what happens when the world decides to forget. The Hangman's Lesson on October 16, 1946. While most of the world slept, a gallows stood in quiet readiness inside the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. Newly built, stark in design, it waited under dim light for history, for reckoning, for something final. This would be the night when justice, vengeance, and ceremony all stood together on the same wooden floor. 10 men were scheduled to die. Men who had ruled empires of brutality, men who had signed the orders that dragged Europe into the abyss. Their verdicts had been decided weeks earlier, but tonight the world would witness what it meant when sentence met ritual. It would not be a public affair, but it was meant to echo through time. The first name on the list was Hermann Göring, Hitler's heir, Luftwaffe commander, architect of the Gestapo. But Göring had no intention of letting the Allies write his final chapter. Just hours before his scheduled hanging, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule. He died alone in his cell. He had stolen his own execution. It was a shock to the system. Symbolism shattered. The rope that had waited for the Reich's second in command was left swinging in air. Göring had denied the Allies the justice they designed. In death, as in life, he dictated his own terms. The gallows waited. The process had to continue. Next was Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, the man who had inked the infamous pact with Stalin. He walked unevenly, muttering fractured words that included, "God protect Germany." Then the noose slipped over his neck, the trapdoor gave way, and silence followed. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel came next, the military man behind forced labor and scorched earth, who once signed away lives with pen strokes. At the gallows, he stood straight, tried to salute, and fell. By 1:20 a.m., he was dead. Ernst Kaltenbrunner followed, the highest-ranking SS official to stand trial, towering in frame and hollow in spirit. His role in deportations, torture, and mass execution was beyond denial, but he tried to deny it anyway, until the last second. Hans Frank, once the Governor-General of occupied Poland, mumbled lines of scripture. Julius Streicher, the voice behind years of anti-Semitic hate in Der Stürmer, went out shouting, "Heil Hitler," spitting defiance until the trapdoor silenced him. The others, Rosenberg, Sockel, Frick, Seyss-Inquart, met their end with less spectacle, quiet, expressionless. Names that once carried terror, now reduced to twitching silhouettes in the shadows of history. By 3 a.m., 10 bodies lay on stretchers, photographed, documented, faces fixed in death, mouths slack, ropes still tight across purpled necks. The official U.S. Army report called the executions professional, but others who were present remembered it differently. Behind the curtain, there was chaos, the kind that doesn't make it into transcripts. Witnesses, guards, chaplains, medics described a night that felt rushed, unsteady. Some nooses had been mismeasured. Instead of swift neck breaks, a few of the condemned strangled slowly. Stryker's death was especially grim, his body jerking, his cries lingering longer than anyone expected. There was no grace, only a rope, only a floor that gave way. The hangman, Sergeant John C. Woods, had little training. His past was littered with errors. The gallows themselves were pieced together from lumber just days before inside the prison's own carpenter shop. This wasn't theater. It wasn't closure. It was punishment delivered with haste and a strange sense of incompleteness. The Nuremberg Trials were supposed to set a new precedent. For the first time, a multinational court had held individuals, men, not governments, responsible for crimes against humanity. That alone was historic. The executions were meant to seal that idea, to show the world that the highest ranks of evil could be named, judged, and brought to justice. But even as the bodies cooled, an unease settled over Nuremberg. These were not the only guilty men. These were just the ones caught, tried, and made visible. Beneath their names stood hundreds more, many already slipping into the post-war shadows, untouched, unnamed, unpunished. The world had demanded accountability. The gallows reevaluations. But together they sketched a chilling truth. Justice had not failed. It had been sidelined. Cold War calculus had redrawn the lines. The West wanted a strong Germany, and strong meant experienced, connected, familiar, even if that meant shaking hands with men who had once fed the ovens. This wasn't mercy, it was politics. In the American zones, pressure grew to empty the prisons. Chancellor Adenauer's government pushed hard. Conservatives wanted their people back. The U.S., desperate to anchor West Germany against the Soviet bloc, gave in one by one. The cell doors opened. By 1958, hundreds had been freed. Engineers, executives, bureaucrats, doctors, killers. They took new jobs, wrote memoirs, moved to quieter towns. There were no truth commissions, no televised confessions, just silence, a deliberate forgetting. Forgiveness was never offered. It wasn't even asked for. What came instead was erasure, a clean slate drawn in the chalk dust of destroyed files and fading memories. The past was inconvenient. The future was urgent. And in the rush to rebuild, justice became a casualty. For the victims, for the dead, for the generations left with photographs and ashes, it was betrayal in slow motion. A wound left open, not by time, but by choice. The amnesty wave. History is not fixed. It edits itself. One era's criminal becomes another's inconvenient relic or even a reclaimed asset. By the mid-1950s, the tide that had swept scores of former Nazis into prison began to withdraw, slowly but unmistakably. The world, now transfixed by the Cold War's encroaching shadow, modern reckonings and justice delayed. The clocks in Nuremberg's Palace of Justice had long since stopped. The thunderous voice of judgment that once reverberated through its marble halls had faded into a faint murmur, smothered beneath layers of economic progress, social prosperity, and collective silence. Yet, in the quiet spaces between decades, not everyone forgot. Justice, though dulled by time, had not disappeared. It had merely changed its form, less declarative, more fragile, but still unmistakably there. This new reckoning did not begin in courtrooms under the gaze of international tribunals. It began in the quiet corners of domestic life, in late-night conversations between adult children and aging parents, in university seminars where a single question could steal a room, in the musty pages of family photo albums where uniforms and armbands lay half concealed behind smiles. The war had ended, but its memory had not. And as post-war Germany evolved, first into stability, then into affluence, it was the younger generations who began to excavate the past. They combed through archives. They listened to survivors. They asked the questions that had long been left unspoken. By the 1980s, the shift had gained momentum. It was no longer foreign powers or occupying forces that sought answers. It was Germans themselves. The grandchildren of the Reich wanted to know, who were these men in the photographs? What did they do during the war? And why had no one ever spoken of them? Often, the trail led to men still alive, men who had quietly built post-war lives, living in modest bungalows, wearing slippers instead of jackboots, attending church and drawing pensions. Their pasts had been buried as inconvenient footnotes until someone lifted the lid. And when they did, the machinery of justice stirred again. John Demjanjuk was among the first to face this renewed scrutiny. A retired auto worker living in suburban Cleveland, he was accused of having been a guard at Sobibor, a Nazi extermination camp. Demjanjuk denied the charge. His case became an international legal saga stretching over decades and continents. He was stripped of his U.S. citizenship, deported, tried in Israel, later retried in Germany, and ultimately convicted in 2011 at the age of 91. Not for giving orders, but for enabling mass murder through his participation. He died a free man while his appeal was pending, but the symbolic weight of his trial was considerable. It shattered the long-standing assumption that time could insulate guilt, or that age softened culpability. He was not alone. In 2015, Oskar Gröning, once a low-ranking SS officer stationed at Auschwitz, stood trial at 94. His role had been administrative, counting money seized from prisoners, sorting through their belongings. He insisted his work had been peripheral, but the court disagreed. He had participated, however indirectly, in a system designed for annihilation. His conviction affirmed a new legal standard. One did not need to commit murder personally to be complicit in it. Then came Bruno Day, just a teenager, when he stood watch in a Nazi camp. He was tried in 2020 at the age of 93. Frail and soft-spoken, he listened as survivors recounted horrors he had never inflicted but had witnessed, had guarded. That, too, was deemed sufficient grounds for guilt. These were not the grand villains of the Nazi pantheon. There were no dramatic declarations of ideology, no chilling salutes, no defiant rhetoric. These were accountants, clerks, guards, men whose jobs once seemed too minor to merit notice. For years, their roles had been overlooked, their responsibilities dismissed as tangential. But the judicial lens had finally narrowed. It came to understand that systems of terror are not sustained by monsters alone. They are sustained by the ordinary, by the compliant, by those who choose not to look away. Not everyone welcomed these trials. Some dismissed them as symbolic spectacles, acts of belated vengeance enacted upon frail men with failing memories. Others saw them as futile gestures, too late to matter. But for survivors and for the descendants of those who never came home, these prosecutions held a different meaning. They were not about imprisonment or punishment. They were about bearing witness. They were about affirming, even decades later, that silence does not confer innocence, and that history's long arc can still bend, however slightly, toward accountability. Why now? Why, after so long, had the machinery of justice resumed? Part of the answer lies in simple human persistence. As long as one witness remained alive, as long as a single voice could still speak the truth, there remained an opportunity to confront the past. But another reason was generational. The immediate post-war decades had been focused on recovery, on rebuilding a nation fractured and divided. Dealing too openly with the past had threatened fragile coalitions, unsettled still raw wounds. But once stability and reunification had taken root, space opened for memory, for interrogation, or reckoning. Culture followed suit. German filmmakers, writers, and documentarians began exploring less sanitized versions of the past. No longer were narratives confined to heroic resistors or tragic conscripts. Now, the stories focused on quiet complicity, on neighbors who watched, teachers who indoctrinated, bureaucrats who enabled. The Holocaust ceased to be merely a historical event. It became personal. And with that shift came a deeper understanding of responsibility. Germany, unlike many nations, chose to confront this history head-on. Its memorials, its museums, its national curriculum all engaged directly with the crimes of the Third Reich. Not out of pride, but out of duty. The nation positioned its shame not at the margins, but at the center of its democratic identity. It became, in effect, a form of national conscience, and yet some doors would never open. Adolf Eichmann had been captured and tried in Jerusalem. Joseph Mengele died under an assumed name off the coast of Brazil. Martin Bormann's bones were discovered decades later, hidden beneath a Berlin sidewalk. Many of the principal architects of genocide escaped justice entirely. No courtroom could reclaim them. No tribunal could retroactively restore balance. But justice is not always defined by verdicts. Sometimes it is the public utterance of a name. Sometimes it is the surfacing of a face once thought lost to history. Sometimes it is the simple, painful gift of knowing who signed a deportation order, who was there when a grandfather was taken away. Sometimes justice is memory itself, persistent, unsanitized, unwilling to yield to time's erasures. And sometimes it is simply this: the refusal to look away. Even when the world has. Evil does not always exit the stage when the verdict is read. It lingers in silence, in bureaucracy, in the quiet return to normal life. The years after Nuremberg did not close the chapter, they only dimmed the spotlight. What followed was not absolution, but avoidance. Men who once enabled slaughter lived out their days in gardens and boardrooms. Others were dragged, gray and trembling, into courtrooms decades too late. Some died before sentence, others before memory caught up. But justice was never just about punishment. It was about the question that refuses to go away. What did you do when it mattered? That question is the echo that lives beyond the trials. It lives in archives, in unmarked graves, in the eyes of survivors who were told to move on. It's not just for the guilty, but for all of us. Because evil rarely ends with a bang. It ends when no one speaks, when the world forgets, and memory, when summoned, is the last form of justice we still possess.